Sí, buenas tardes con todos. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos en esta sesión. Espero que hayan disfrutado de un extraordinario almuerzo. Siguiendo con el programa, nos corresponde ahora dar inicio a la sesión Competir hacia el primer mundo, que empezará con una conferencia muy esperada, dictada por el profesor Michael Porter. Como ustedes saben, el profesor Porter es la autoridad número 1 en estudios de competitividad en el mundo. No solo es un destacado académico de la Universidad de Harvard, sino también es un director activo en muchas empresas multinacionales y asesor de gobernantes y gobiernos del mundo en el tema de competitividad. Con esta conferencia termina de tener forma una primera y muy comprometida iniciativa del sector privado en torno a la competitividad. Este es un trabajo, como ustedes saben, que se ha desarrollado por muchos profesionales de primerísimo nivel a lo largo de muchísimos meses y constituye pues un primer gran paso de nuestro mundo empresarial, de nuestro sector privado en torno a la competitividad, y estoy seguro que sin duda esto solo es el inicio y la tarea por delante está claramente definida en función a lo que ya estamos escuchando, como todos ustedes ya lo saben. Quiero dar entonces pase al doctor Porter con su conferencia. Posteriormente tendremos el panel, la mesa de debate. Doctor Porter, once again, welcome to Peru.
Well, I am so honored to be at this incredible meeting. I've heard about Cade for many years, but this is my first time here, and I think it's particularly interesting and exciting and important that we're meeting in the Highlands, not in Lima, because I think that's part of the future of Peru. And I think it's very interesting and important that we're meeting at a public school, because I think that's part of the future of Peru. And I'm so pleased that we have so many leaders here from the private sector, from government. I'm very honored that the presidential candidates, a number of them are here today. And I think we're here to talk about a subject that we all care about, which is how to ensure a very bright future for this country of Peru. Not just for a few people, but for all Peruvian citizens. And this is a topic and a question where really this whole process for me began 1 year ago. Some of you may have been there when I was here a year ago and talked about competitiveness. And as I was here and as I was talking to many of you about the country, about what was going on, I got a sense that there was a real opportunity to change. And as a result of that, with the help of a number of you, we have been through a process over the last 12 months of bringing together people, talking about ideas, collecting data, and trying to come up with at least a starting point for some strategic thinking and action planning for the next chapter of Peru's economic history. And it's that work that I'd like to talk about today. I don't want to imply that this work is the last word. In fact, what I'd like to suggest is this work that I'm going to present today is just the beginning of the discussion. But hopefully, all of you in Peru can have a constructive discussion about the future with a common framework and with a common set of ideas and principles for thinking about what will determine the future success of this economy. Now, I know that you've already heard from quite a few speakers during this conference, and I see that I'm having to compete a little bit with, but I'll go slow, and I'm fine. I know President Toledo a little bit. Welcome. I know you've heard from a number of other speakers, and I know that you've heard a variety of opinions, and I would like to suggest that I think you're going to find that much of what you've heard is going to be very consistent with what I have to say. But what I'm going to try to provide you in this presentation is with a lot of data and with a lot of evidence that I think hopefully will make what we know needs to be done even clearer. And we'll start to put in place some of the structure and process and goals that are necessary to move Peru forward. Just to kind of summarize what I'd like to say today, I'd like to make 6 major points. So as before we get into the details, let's just think about the big message here. The big message is we have 6 fundamental agendas in Peru. Number 1, we have to agree that it's time for the next chapter for Peru. We can't just keep repeating the last chapter and rereading the last chapter. It's time for the next chapter. And we have to figure out what the next chapter is. And in order to do that, we have to be very sophisticated because we can't do everything. So number 1, it's time for the next chapter. Number 2, we need a strategic vision for the future economy of the country that everybody understands at some level, that people can get excited about, and that will put us on that path that we all want to get to ultimately, which is a prosperous country where prosperity is shared among all the citizens. Number 3, that strategic vision is going to have a critical component, which is economic diversification. The country will not be able to be successful in the long run unless it can diversify its economy substantially, and that's going to happen in 2 basic ways. One is we're going to have to build some clusters outside of our traditional fields of expertise, and number 2, Peru is going to need to create some regional hubs besides Lima. If 5 years from now or 10 years from now all the economic activity in Peru is still mostly in Lima, we'll fail. We've got to create some other hubs, and we've got to have a strategy for doing that. So that's number 3. Number 4, in order to pursue an economic strategy for the country, we need to set some measurable goals about what we can achieve over the next 10 years or so. And I'd like to propose 11 goals. It would be nice if it was only 10. But I'm going to propose 11 goals because I think these are the right 11 goals. Now, this is not the end of the discussion. There may be 15 goals, there may be 12, there may be 10, there may be 8. But we need some clear, measurable goals that will give us a clear sense of kind of how can we tell whether we're going to make it. And so we'll talk about some goals. Number 5, what I've found is that success in economic development is partly a function of strategy, but it's just as much a function of organization, how we organize in order to actually carry out economic policy. And so I'd like to propose at least some preliminary thoughts about an organizational structure for Peru's future economic strategy. And then finally, number 6, if any of this is going to be truly successful, the private sector of Peru, you, are going to have to play a somewhat different role than you played in the past. You're going to have to do some different things. You're going to have to organize yourself in some different ways. You're going to have to broaden perhaps your field of vision. You're going to have to take on some roles that you haven't taken on before. And your willingness and ability to do that is going to have everything to do with the success of the country. These are 6 fundamental agendas that I believe are going to allow this country to achieve the promise that we all know it has. Now, I respect Al Gore a lot, but I think he was too optimistic. I don't think it's automatic that Peru is going to be successful. I think there's a great opportunity, better than most, but it's not automatic. We have to get on the same page. We have to have a strategy. We have to figure out how we're going to organize. That's going to allow this country to be successful. Now, I'm going to start in just a few moments showing you slides. And slides are both a blessing and a curse. They're a blessing because they allow you to see pictures and numbers. They're a curse because you get bogged down in them. I'm going to go through these data very quickly with you because I think it's important that you see these data. But I also want to say that these slides that I'm going to show today are going to be made available to any of you, all of you. And I would suggest that we not worry too much about covering every point, but we try to understand really the big picture. And we'll make these slides available to you. We also are preparing a written report, a paper that summarizes the work that's been done here in Peru over the last 8 to 10 months. So there's going to be lots of opportunity to look at the details. What I'm going to try to do in this presentation is kind of focus on the big messages, the big picture, show you some of the critical pieces of data, but without trying to cover everything. And that's going to mean that I might be skipping fairly rapidly over material. I hope you'll forgive me for that, but I don't want to take so much time that we kind of lose energy and that we kind of lose the big message. So let's begin. How do we think about Peru's economy? How we think about how Peru needs to go? How we think about what steps need to be taken? What should that future strategy be? How do we approach that question? Well, in order to think about the question, I think we have to sort of step back and understand kind of where is the country in its economic development. And I think most of you know the general story pretty well. This has been an economic growth success story for at least the last decade, both compared to your own history, but also in comparison to many peers. You all know this picture. This is GDP per capita, and this is how it's looked over the last 60 or 70 years in Peru. There was a history of growth, then there was a fairly long period of going in the wrong direction, and beginning in the early 90s, the country got back on the right trajectory, and we can see that progress is good today. The strength of this economy has been manifested by the degree to which you were able to deal with this economic crisis without massive disruption that we've seen in other parts of the world. In terms of GDP per capita, Peru has been growing rapidly. You're up in the better league, the big league. You're not growing as fast as China or Vietnam or India, but you've been growing pretty darn fast. And you've kind of worked your way up in terms of prosperity. You're working your way up nicely. This is enormously positive. One of the key reasons for this success has been some sound macroeconomic policies. This country has had very good macroeconomic management since the mid-90s. It's because of trade opening that you've been willing to undertake, which is scary, and many Latin American countries have had a hard time pursuing. We've also, of course, been in a very supportive international environment for most of this period until the last year or two, which has allowed growth to be a little bit easier than had been in the past. So we've got to recognize that, but there's no doubt that policies that were set worked, and they're still working, and we should be proud of that. In terms of exports, Peru is not yet a very high exporting country, given its size. But as you see here, you've been gaining world export share over the last 10 years. You've kind of worked up in terms of exports as a percentage of GDP. You're not high for a country of your size, but you're getting there. And the question is, can we keep this momentum moving? Can we keep improving the trade, the ability to export? Can we broaden that ability, as we'll see later? is critical. One of the other critical conditions for this success historically has been the ability to achieve security and stability. Political stability, economic stability, and kind of a sense of peace and security. And of course, that is no means guaranteed for the future. In fact, recently, I think the challenges are becoming even apparent again of how hard it is for a country to actually do that. All these things are good. But as we look at our performance in Peru, we all know, I hope, we all know that it's not a complete success. It's not a complete success yet, for a variety of reasons. Number one, there's been a lot of heterogeneity. Not everybody has benefited from this economic growth. And that's particularly clear, of course, when we look at things like unemployment. Given a very rapidly growing economy, it's quite surprising to see that unemployment hasn't gone down. And that's because our growth is driven by fields that don't employ a lot of people. And we haven't found a way to share that growth in more jobs in more fields. We all know that. We've made a big stab at knocking down poverty, but it's still high. And it's very heterogeneous. As we look across the country, we see enormous divergence in poverty rates in different parts of the country. We haven't managed to get a process going that is substantially reducing this disparity. And I can tell you, even from the United States experience, that unless we reduce these disparities, it's a time bomb. You'll never be successful in the long run in a democracy where you have huge disparities. We've seen it over and over again. If you don't reduce the disparities, if everybody doesn't feel like they're benefiting from economic growth, then the political process starts to work against you, not for you. Politicians then have a hard time supporting business if business is not leading to broad prosperity. And so this is a very important moment. We have to understand this lesson. We can't go through the lesson that we've seen in other Latin American countries, and I won't name any names. You all know the names, of what happens when you actually don't deal with the disparities, when you don't actually solve that problem. One of the critical issues facing their economy in Peru, you all know, which is lack of diversification, economic diversification. In a wider variety of fields, requiring a wider variety of skills, we're too dependent on a relatively small number of fields in order to drive our growth and our exports. And those fields are exposing us to a certain amount of volatility that so far has been good. So far commodity prices have been good. Here they're going up again recently. But they also go down. And we know if we look over any 10-year period of history, we're going to have periods where this is a problem. And we can't get ourselves into a situation where we're so dependent on a relatively small number of fields that we can't be resilient and continue to move forward. Again, the export intensity is better, but it's still not high. The mix of exports has shifted a bit, but not that much. You can see that the big exports in 62 are pretty much still the same big exports today. Yes, we've got a bit more diversification, but not much, not enough. Not enough to move the needle in terms of employment, not enough to move the needle in terms of really spreading the economic growth across the country in an important way. If you look at the nature of our exports in Peru, we see the same picture that we've seen for many, many years. The green exports are the processed goods. And we can see that we made limited progress on exporting processed products. The blue is the services. Again, services are meaningful, but again, we've made limited progress. The big growth is in the top two, the unprocessed and the semi-processed. And that's where the real growth has come from. It's been pulling up our world export share. So again, you all know this. This is in one of our critical economic problems in this country is figuring out how to change this picture so that the pattern starts to change in a significantly different direction. It's not an unusual problem. Many resource-rich countries have this problem, but some have learned to tackle it. We have to learn to tackle it here. If we're going to achieve sustained growth going forward, we now have to tackle a whole new set of problems that are more microeconomic problems than macroeconomic problems. Macroeconomics isn't perfect. I'm worried about the credit bubble. I'm worried about all this real estate. I'm worried about it. There's still some macroeconomic issues, but the real constraints, I think, mostly are microeconomic issues, having to do with firms and regulations and markets and infrastructure and stuff like that. We also have institutional problems. Some of the critical institutions in the society are in clear need of improvement. Again, you know what many of those are, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But we have to start tackling that institutional improvement. Because unless we can improve some of these institutions, like our education system, our healthcare system, and others, we're going to have a tough time creating the right kind of environment with the right kind of people, with the right kind of skills to allow us to move to higher levels of productivity and prosperity. Again, we're doing better in Peru at attracting foreign investment. And we should be proud of that. Foreign investment has been growing, but it's still very narrow. Peru is not good enough as a business environment yet to attract wide foreign investment. Yes, if you're going to do mining, you've got to come here. Mining companies will put up with almost anything to get access to the reserves. But when you talk about non-mining companies, they are more picky. They have higher standards. They're more demanding in terms of the business environment. And if we're going to keep moving this picture up and to the right, we're going to have to tackle some of these institutional and microeconomic issues. Again, we all know that. But the question is, what's our strategy? What's our plan? How are we going to get it done? And of course, all of you know that Peru is really still back at the starting line in terms of science, technology, and innovation. I find this chart pretty shocking. That in terms of patenting, innovation output, that Peru would be so weak. There's plenty of smart engineers here. There's lots of Peruvians that are good scientists. Some of them working in Peru and some of them working elsewhere. But we haven't managed to create the right set of institutions within Peru to allow us here to really drive technological progress and innovation. And we know that eventually that will become the key constraint. It's not the constraint yet. We can improve standard of living here in Peru for quite a while without having to have scientific innovation. But we have to put in place the assets and the resources necessary because it takes a long time. Probably takes 20 years or so to build a sort of an science and technology system. And so we have to get started on that, fairly soon if we're going to have one by the time we need it later on. So I guess the bottom line here is, yes, we can sustain 8 to 9% growth. No reason why this country can't sustain it. But in order to do so, we've got to improve our competitiveness. And that's why we're all here. And this is a topic and a theme that I think has been covered, repeatedly already in this conference. What I hope we can do in this session is to put some flesh, anyway, on the bones of, okay, how would we go about doing that? What would that look like? What might be a vision? With the understanding that, again, nobody like me can be the last word. All we can do is start the discussion. But we have to create the right process to carry on that discussion and put it into practice. I believe, as I said a minute ago, that Peru needs really to have an economic strategy. We can't just have a list of policies that we want to improve. We can't just have a list of weaknesses. We need an affirmative strategy. We need a statement of where we want to go in this country, where we can be really competitive. What are the real assets and strengths that we have to build upon? You know, what I found is you can't build an economy that's successful just by reducing weaknesses. To build a successful economy, you have to find your inherent strengths and build up those. And so we need a strategy. We need a strategy that can focus us on what are the most important issues. Can't tackle everything. We need a strategy that kind of chooses where we can really succeed, not tries to compete across the board. We need a strategy that has an action plan and an organizational structure. And we need a strategy around which we can build a broad consensus. There's always going to be things to debate and discuss in any society. There's going to be differences of opinion about many issues. Peru will be successful when there's an agreement on the core of an economic vision. And the disagreement is more about the details of how do you do it. That's what we found in country after country. What we find is successful countries are those when a new government comes in, there are differences, of course. But the basic core economic path is consistent. That's what we have to achieve. That's what I think we have the opportunity to achieve in Peru. And that's what we'll be talking about here in this session. What might that look like? What are the things that we can agree on that make sense? And then how can we kind of get everybody on the same page and doing their part? Now, over the last 8 months or so, I have had the privilege of leading a very interesting process. And I'll tell you that I've never actually been involved in a process like this anywhere else in the world. I've worked at the highest levels in 25 or 30 countries on economic strategy, but the process here was really quite unusual. It started with some private sector leaders who were willing to kind of step up and see if they could sort of nurture a new dialogue, collect some facts, bring our knowledge together. And those private sector leaders, I think, should be congratulated for their vision and their forward-looking investments. We put together a very interesting group of people. You can see here there was an advisory board, which some of you served on, to kind of provide the reality check, make sure this wasn't just, kind of an exercise. We have a joint team with a bunch of Peruvians and a few of us non-Peruvians. I think there's only 2 non-Peruvians, myself and Professor Jorge Ramirez from your neighbor, Colombia, who's my colleague of many, many years. This team, I think, developed a tremendous spirit and pulled together a tremendous amount of interesting work. The team interviewed dozens and dozens of people, I think at least 100 people. Many of you are sitting in this room from all parts of the society about the future of the economy, about competitiveness issues, about what needed to be done. The team organized itself into a number of broad categories: macroeconomics, business environment, cluster development, and organization structure. How would we actually get this done? And you can see some of the critical subtopics that were explored. In one case, the team actually worked with a specific cluster in Peru. It was actually the metal mechanic cluster in Lima. Because we wanted to actually try to work together on a collaborative process of building competitiveness in a particular field, just to see how hard it was in Peru. to help us understand better what some of the obstacles might be to actually making economic changes bottoms up, not just top down. Again, that's another characteristic of all really successful countries. Everything isn't top down, it's also bottoms up. Lots of people are involved in changing and improving and doing things. We don't just wait for political leaders to have to do everything. And we wanted to kind of see what the bottoms up process might look like. This project conducted a survey. And this just gives you, some of the basic data. This was a significant, thoughtful survey about competitiveness issues to very senior people in a whole bunch of companies distributed across the country. We could have surveyed more. But I think it gave us a very good flavor for what sort of the general views were about what the real problems really were. And it was a very interesting part of our process. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about what we learned, but then hopefully as quickly as possible, what we would suggest, based on this group's effort, really needs to be done in terms of direction. But before we do that, I think we all have to get, at some level, on the same page about competitiveness. If the goal is to improve the competitiveness of Peru, what do we mean by competitiveness? And what do we understand are the fundamental drivers of competitiveness? Because if we're going to make progress, we have to kind of have a frame of reference about what are the key causes, what are the key issues. Now again, many of you have heard me speak before, so this is not going to be anything new. Because the fundamentals of competitiveness are timeless. Competitiveness depends on the productivity of the economy. The output that can be produced with a day of work, or a unit of natural resource, or a dollar of capital, or a solar, or whatever the name is. I keep forgetting. I used to think of it as a peso, but it's no longer a peso. If you can be productive, if you can generate a lot of output, for every labor, natural resource, or capital input, you can have a high standard of living. What we find is that the standard of living of a country, the GDP per capita, is exactly determined by productivity. Output per person, output per hectare of land, output per capital investment. That's what determines competitiveness. What we know about competitiveness is that you can be competitive and prosperous in many different fields. No particular field is better than any other. What matters is productivity. It's not whether you're in agriculture or manufacturing. What matters is how productive you are. If you're very productive in agriculture, you can improve your standard of living. If you're not very productive in manufacturing, you'll fail. So what we have to do in any country is we have to understand what's our existing economic activities, how can we make those more productive, and then how can we diversify those over time? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. We know that to build a productive economy in 2010, almost 2011, we have to have a mixture of foreign firms and local firms. Because it's impossible today for any country to learn all there is to know about the economy. We need a lot of technology, we need a lot of help, we need a lot of management ideas. We need to be connected to the rest of the world. And part of the way to be connected is to have foreign firms that want to do business here, who will then create benefits that spread much more widely than their own business. These are some of the fundamentals of competitiveness. Now we know that to build a competitive economy, the private sector has the critical role. You can't have a competitive economy without competitive firms that are world-class, that are run well, that use the best operating methods. But you also can't have a competitive economy without a good business environment that makes it possible for firms to be productive. And so what we need to talk a little bit about now is kind of how do we think about that environment? that we're going to have to improve if we're going to move this country forward. In terms of productivity, Peru is so-so. It's not bad. You're growing productivity, but if I had a lot more countries on this, you would see that you're not special at productivity. You're not special at productivity growth. You've got enough resources that you've been able to grow by just harnessing more of those resources. But you haven't been able to grow in the most fundamental way that leads to prosperity the most broadly, which is to drive up the productivity of the economy very, very rapidly. And we have to figure out how to do this. Now, I've recently, with my team at Harvard and MIT and a group that we have that I've worked with for many years, we've recently kind of re-examined our thinking about competitiveness. And we wanted to kind of take advantage of the latest academic literature and all the new learning about competitiveness, as well as build on the work that we've done in the past. And this chart really is the result of, I think, what we've learned about competitiveness, and about which I think there's now compelling evidence. Competitiveness is really a function of 3 levels of issues. Number 1, competitiveness is based, at least partly, on endowment. If you have a good endowment, a natural endowment, a locational endowment, that helps a lot, particularly at lower levels of income. Now, what do we mean by endowment? Well, things like Peru has. Natural resources, of course. Locational assets. A lot of evidence that being on an ocean is great. Being in a region where there's other customers around in other countries nearby is good. So location matters. And so does cultural legacy and kind of the spirit of the people and the mindsets and the attitudes. And here, again, Peru is pretty richly endowed, with quite a great culture, with quite a pretty good work ethic, some entrepreneurial spirit that I think there was a wide consensus on. These things didn't come from me. These things came from hundreds of people, hundreds of you, as we talked about this question of what is the endowment of this country. Because this endowment is critical to build upon. It's going to be one of the ways that we determine our strategy. We have to really understand this endowment. And it's a great start. But we also know that the endowment isn't enough. The endowment will take you so far. You can sell your endowment. You can sell your natural resources. You can sell the fruits of your land. And that will take you a certain distance, but it won't take you to wealth and true prosperity. In order to go all the way, you've got to use your endowment productively. You've got to take every hectare of land and you've got to make sure that you're generating a lot of output that's valuable. You've got to take every natural resource and make it productive. You've got to take every person and make them productive. And if you can do that, if you can take that endowment and make it productive, boy, that's what makes you an advanced economy. And in order to do that, the next challenge is what we call macroeconomic competitiveness. This refers to what you might call framework conditions. These are sort of conditions that are sort of the foundational type conditions. And these are things like this. In terms of human development, you've got to have good basic education. People can't read and write, you'll never be productive. People don't have some basic level of training and skill, you'll never be productive. If people aren't healthy, you'll never be productive. We know this now. There's compelling evidence on this. Political institutions have to work so that there can be a productive dialogue, so that there can be stability, so that government can work and do its job well. And of course, we need a rule of law, because if we don't obey the law, we can't be productive. If we can't get our disagreements settled quickly, we can't be productive. If we have corruption, we can't be productive. And this, again, there's compelling evidence about how important these things are for the way countries grow and develop. Macroeconomic policy, you all know. That has to do with fiscal and monetary policy and how we manage those variables. Again, there's no surprise that Peru's been pretty good at those. Now, this slide actually illustrates another very, very important point, and it's incredibly important for this country right now, which is that when we think about economic development, we can't think about economic development alone. Because if we think about economic development alone, we'll fail. We've got to understand that economic development inherently requires social development too. That if we can't be improving the capacity of our citizens, then our economic development is going to run out. We're going to run out of people with skill. We're going to run out. And we're not going to have those foundations that are necessary to build that productive economy. And I think too often economic policy fails because it's too narrow. And leaders that develop economic policy just think too much in the box of economics or macroeconomics. And don't start to understand that if you want to get really wealthy, you've got to deal with these other things too. Again, all of you know this. But again, to take this country for the next chapter of this book, the book of modern Peru, we're going to have to do something about this. And then, of course, there's the pinnacle of competitiveness, which is the microeconomic competitiveness. And this has to do with the capabilities of firms, many of which you're running, who hopefully have the great technology, who hopefully are using the best methods, who have the best IT systems, who have good strategies, who are aggressive in continuous improvement. So we need great firms. We also need a great business environment that provides the right environment for firms to compete in. And of course, the business environment, those of you who know my work know that that's the diamond. The quality of the inputs, the human resource quality, the physical infrastructure quality, and so on. The rules of the game that drive competition rather than monopoly, rather than distortions, rather than biases. The sophistication and demanding customer that now starts to expect quality and demand good products and services as to drive the economy forward. And finally, the availability of supporting industries. I mean, we got a lot of mining companies in Peru that have mines, and they got a fence around them, and everything else is brought from outside. And you can't build a productive economy that way. It's too expensive. You need local suppliers and supporting industries in order to be productive. Again, there's evidence, compelling evidence about this from other countries in the world. So in order to build competitiveness, we've got to create that business environment. And then we've got to build these areas of strength. What we know about economic development is that economic development is driven heavily by clustering, where you don't just have one firm or two firms in a given field, but you have multiple firms and supporting institutions. Here's a cluster in Peru, not too far away from here. It could be stronger. It could be more productive. But there's the cluster. There's not just things to see in Cusco. There's restaurants. They're part of the cluster. There's travel agencies. They're part of the cluster. There's educational institutions that are part of the cluster. We had one of my student teams at Harvard did the study on this cluster, and it's a very interesting case of work in process. The kind of thing, hopefully, we can build more deeply throughout the country. Think about how important a cluster is. What determines your success in tourism is how many dollars per day your tourist will spend. And if they have a backpack and they spend $20 a day, you're not going to get very prosperous as a country, because that doesn't support very high wages. But if you can get your tourist to spend $1,000 a day, then think of the prosperity you've created from the same natural assets. How would they spend $1,000 a day? Because they have wonderful hotels. They're willing to pay $300 a day for the hotel. They have wonderful restaurants. They're willing to pay a couple $100s a day for restaurants. That you have great guides who provide a good service experience, so they're willing to hire a guide and pay that guide well because of the quality. And clusters and building these critical masses of expertise allow you to get more productive. And we see that, again, all over the world in economies everywhere. And this just gives some of the details. Now, this slide is a bit of a challenge. But I want to show it to you because it's a very fundamental point for Peru right now. So what this slide does is it takes all the clusters in the economy. I won't bore you with how we've calculated these clusters and all that, but trust me, we did it carefully. And what you see is that clusters are not totally disconnected. Yes, automotive cluster is different than the metal mining cluster, but they're actually related. There's overlap. There's certain technologies and skills and knowledge and raw materials that are common across the cluster. And what this slide does, based on very complex statistical analysis, is to show how the various clusters of the economy connect and intersect. And the clusters that are close to each other are clusters that are the most related, and the clusters that are overlapping are the clusters that are even more related, and the clusters in the same color are the clusters that are the most related. Okay? So why is this important for Peru? Well, what we're going to see later is Peru is just starting to even show up on this chart. But what we know is economies grow by following these overlaps. And if we're going to have an economic diversification in Peru, we're going to have to take advantage of that thinking. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. As economies develop, they go through some fundamental transformations. All economies start by depending on their natural endowments. People, natural resources, whatever. If they're successful, they can become productive in using those endowments. And then to be really successful, you have to become innovative. Not just to do what other countries do at better cost, but actually come up with unique products and services. Peru's definitely kind of starting to make the transition between what we call the factor-driven and the investment-driven economy. But talking about what that looks like is everything to do with the next chapter for this country. Well, enough theory. As I said a minute ago, our team did a comprehensive assessment based on all the studies that we could find, many interviews, surveys, and so forth, trying to kind of size up where Peru stood on many of these issues. And the next few slides I won't go through in great detail, but what we do is we kind of look at each of those areas and talk about what's going well and talk about what some of the weaknesses are. Again, I would be very surprised if most of you weren't able to agree with 75, 80, 90% of this. And our job today is not to go through all the details. But I want to just give you a flavor for the nature of this work. So macroeconomic policy has been actually one of the real strengths in Peru. Done very well. If you look at the metrics that we use to evaluate macroeconomic policy, it's probably the strongest area of all in the economic policy agenda of the country compared to other countries. And you all know the key points. That said, there's still areas for improvement. We're concerned about the dependence on commodities in public finance rather than a broadly based tax system. We're concerned about how high the official taxes are and how narrow the tax base is. That's not a good way to raise taxes, is to raise it narrowly with just a few fields with high rates. We're worried about credit and the rules and for managing the stability of borrowing and the financial system. There's a bubble here right now. And, you may want to ignore it, but I hope you don't, because there's a bubble, and bubbles pop, and people get hurt. And so we have some macroeconomic issues. But that's not the number one challenge, and as we'll see later. We've got some issues on political institutions. You know these well. On the top of this list is actually the area of corruption. Here's the data, the latest data on the corruption indexes. You've seen these. Peru's kind of in the middle, not horrible right now. But what is somewhat disturbing is that this is actually a year old. What's disturbing is that we're on the wrong side. We're not on the improving side. We're on the deteriorating side. Okay, and I think this data is absolutely accurate from everything we found out, through our study. So there's something wrong here, and we got to tackle this issue. There's some institutional problems that are leading to that. We've got an issue with security. There's been a deterioration in security, and it comes from a lot of things that you all know much better than I. But I can tell you that this, if it gets bad enough, literally stops the train. The train no longer goes. Everything stops in the economy when this gets bad enough. And you're not there yet, but we need a concerted plan here. And it's complicated, as you all know. So this is a big issue. We all understand the education system's got a long way to go. This school, I'm told, because I haven't actually visited before, but this school, I think, is a great school. But we don't have enough of them like this, and eventually that is going to come back and bite us. Because if we want more people to have jobs, we're going to have more people that have some basic skills. We have a healthcare problem. The system isn't working very well. It's not structured very well. It's not managed very well. And again, that's going to come back and bite us if we don't do something about it. In terms of the business environment, this is too busy. But we've just tried to kind of capture the essence of where we think the kind of big issues are. There's some strengths, no doubt. But we've got some issues in physical infrastructure. We've got some skill problems in the labor force. You all know that. We don't have the kind of labor force skills that match the demand in the economy. We've got some still barriers to forming new businesses, too much informality because it's too complicated to be formal and too expensive. We've got some rigidities in our labor situation. I know this is a very sensitive issue. But no country with labor rigidities that are extreme has ever been prosperous. Ever. So, we may want to just think that we don't have to do anything about it. But we need to find a good balance between the rights of workers and having workers benefit from economic growth, but also enough flexibility to be productive and to allow productivity growth to occur. So, and we got to strike that balance, and we have to. It can't be ideological. We can't be, opening the Bible and preaching to each other. We have to be practical about how to create a win-win situation for everybody. What I found is if one side of these discussions has too much power, you won't be successful. You have to find an area that works for all parts of society. And this is just one of those areas. Again, none of these things here are going to surprise you. They didn't come from me. They came from data sets. They came from interviews. They came from surveys. The very interesting question then is, what do we do about it? And I've got lots more details. By the way, this is one of the nice things that's happened. I know it's been well publicized, but Peru started to do better on sort of the doing business indicators of ease of doing business. And this just shows that you're in I think it probably feels good to be better than Chile, right? Even though they did invent Pisco? No, no, no. It was the Peruvians. That's the last time I'm going to say the word Chile. I promise. It's nice to be in that position. That's what you can do if enough people get a consensus that something is a good thing to do. You can do it. You've proven that in this case. Again, I'm not going to go through all these areas. There's a good agenda in physical infrastructure that we could talk about. There's an important agenda in terms of the trade environment. It's better, it's good, but it needs to be improved. There's some progress on the consumer side and on the regulatory side in terms of setting the right regulatory standards. But here, like many other areas in Peru, the laws aren't that bad. The enforcement and implementation isn't so good. So that tells us that we have some issues in terms of the effectiveness of how the government works, which we have to deal with. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Very limited supplier base. If we look at the kind of clusters in Peru, where we compete today, no surprises. Precious metals, mining, mostly metal mining, fishing, agriculture, hospitality and tourism. Actually, we're not all that special there yet, despite our tremendous endowments. What this slide shows you is the dotted line across the slide is the average share of world exports of Peru. So any cluster that's above that average is an area where Peru has a real strength. And this is measured in terms of exports. And of course, services can be exported as well. Anything to the right of the solid line is growing market share in the world. Anything to the left is losing market share in the world. So we can see that tourism is not that strong relative to the size of this country. It's gaining a little share, but not very much. Where we've been really gaining is in the really pure resource plays, on the mining and precious metals, which is mining as well. This looks at, if you look at the little box down in the middle, and you explode that box, this is what you see. So this is actually fairly interesting. What we see is that there's quite a few little clusters, mini clusters, and some of them are spread in different parts of the country that are actually gaining share. They're not very big, but they're gaining share. So I think this is very encouraging. This shows that there is some diversification going on. There is some spillover of this economic growth. But it's very nascent. It's very embryonic so far. And the question is, what sort of policy environment would we want to put in place? What kind of private sector initiatives would we want to put in place to actually give this a push without being distortive, without protecting, without subsidizing? We'll talk about that. So if you took my funny bubble chart from before and said, where's Peru? These areas that are shaded are the areas where Peru has a substantial position in the world relative to its size. And again, there'll be no surprises here. The dark green, which is the precious metals and the mining, that's where you're the strongest relative to other countries, relative to your size. If we look at fishing and agriculture, that's where you're kind of in the middle in terms of strong. And then you're just a little bit strong, but doing better in apparel and tourism. But what you see is that there's just very few areas there that you've really developed. And if I showed you other countries, which I don't have time to do, it would be very different. It would look different. Now, how are you going to grow? Well, what we know is that if you're going to grow in things that are touching where you're strong. And so in terms of our economic diversification plan, this is giving us some direction here that we need to build upon. And we'll come back and talk a little bit about that later on. We are starting to see some clusters spring up in various regions of the country. Again, you'll know all this. I didn't. Our team pulled together a lot of this data. But there's things happening. Some of the regions are starting to show some vitality and economic specialization, not just the colossus of Lima. And we need to build on that. And of course, our assessment looks at how are we doing on cluster development, how are we doing on cluster development policies. And again, I won't cover that in detail here because time is so short. Where I want to spend most of the rest of my time is on strategy, structure, and goals. Given this assessment, how might we create a strategy? What is a strategy for a country from an economic point of view? And the way we think about that is a strategy starts with a value proposition for the country. How is this country going to create value as a business location? What's unique? What strengths do we have that if we build on them, if we improve, could actually allow us to be a very high value place to do business? And what we know is we're not going to be able to do that everywhere. We're going to have to kind of pick our spots. That value proposition then starts to help us understand what are the critical strengths that we have to invest in at all costs that really, really matter. And what are the weaknesses that we have where we may not have to have a strength, but we got to get good enough so that compared to our peer competitors, other countries that are like us, we at least are in the game. And that's a good example of security. If security isn't good enough, we're not even in the game. We're not going to win anything. So that's an example of maintaining some level of parity with other countries of the same similar state of development and strategy. When you can articulate such a value proposition, you get some really important benefits. Number one, hopefully you can inspire your citizens about the future and get everybody thinking in a common direction. And understanding why things have to change and understanding why these areas are getting so much attention. Number two, if you have a value proposition, if you can communicate that, you send a signal to the rest of the world. We're open for business. Here's what we do. Come here. This is a great place to do this, to do that. Rather than just saying, Peru's wonderful, everybody come here. That doesn't work very well. I mean, if countries like Singapore were successful because it was clear what platform they offered. And in their case, they were really competing to be a location for multinationals to serve Asia. And in order to do that, they had to have phenomenal physical infrastructure, ports, airports, telecom, and so forth. And they spent every dime they had for 25 years to build the best physical infrastructure in the world, because that was part of their strategy. That's what we have to create the same kind of thinking here for Peru. And of course, we need a value proposition to help all the policymakers stay focused on what really needs to be done to drive the country forward. Now, what I'd like to present now very briefly is kind of 4 steps. I'd like to talk a little bit about the value proposition of Peru, some of our preliminary thinking. I'd like to talk a little bit about the metrics and goals that come out of that we would want to set out as our targets, national targets. I'd like to talk a little bit about the action agenda, although not much because that's too detailed, too complicated. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about how we would actually organize ourselves to implement this. Again, I want to emphasize yet again, this is not the last word. This is just starting the discussion. Some of you are going to look at these slides and you're going to point at some page and you're going to say, oh, I don't agree with that. Fine. It's okay. Let's discuss it. Let's debate it. Let's improve it. Let's figure out what the real truth is. But directionally, hopefully, this is giving us the beginning of hopefully a discussion that we can be having and implementing for years to come. Now, in terms of what's unique about Peru, that's always the starting point for thinking about national strategy. You know, what about you could be a real strength? And we've identified things that you will all recognize. Again, these were not from me. These were from you. This was talking to a lot of thoughtful people that knew the country really well. It's not meant to be necessarily the whole list. There may be more things that we can add to this list. It's kind of our starting point for thinking about strategy. What do we want to be unique at? And these are some of the assets that we have. You know, for example, it's pretty unique in Latin America to be open these days. And to have gotten over the ideological battles about that. So that's good. That's something we can build on. And you can see the other things. In terms of kind of articulating that national value proposition, we would just offer what I would call a sketch. It's not a painting, not a photograph, it's not even a picture. It's a sketch. It has some shape, might have a few colors, but it's not filled out. And that sketch would look something like this. That at all costs, we have to preserve our natural and cultural resources. Because that's going to determine our identity as a country, and these are enormous riches that we want to pass on to the next generation in 50 years, and 50 years after that. So we got to preserve that. In building an economy, though, we have sort of 4 pillars of this way of thinking. Number one, we've got to be the place that's secure, neutral, and peaceful. And if we can do that in Latin America, if we can do that for a long time, that's going to make us special. That's going to be, you know, part A of our plan. Number two, we've got to get more value out of our natural resources by being more sophisticated, by being more productive, by deploying better skill, by using better technology, by building clusters, not just mines, not just tourist attractions. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. Number three, we have the potential, and we already are to some extent, a hub for trade in our region. We are probably most connected to other countries in the world and most open to other countries in the world of any Latin American country I'm aware of. And we've got to build on that. And we have the diversity of population and heritage that will simply reinforce that. So this is kind of the third pillar of our plan. How do we leverage this and build it? And then finally, we have to create dynamic regional development outside of a large capital city. Because if we can create some other regional centers, we will not only be able to distribute prosperity more broadly in the country, but we will actually create the kind of productivity and dynamism and diversification that all the really successful economies have. Again, there's very few large countries that are successful with only one growth center. The United States is successful because we have dozens of growth centers. China is successful because it has dozens of growth centers. We've got to widen our growth around regional diversification and differentiation. We want the regions to start developing their own identity, their own economy, their own assets. And then there's some cross-cutting policies that, if any of this is going to happen, are going to need to get better. some of which we're already doing. That's the general notion of kind of what might a value proposition look like. Is it the last word? No. There's probably some good ideas that you are having immediately about, okay, maybe change that a little bit. But it's a start. It starts with what's unique. It says, how could we build an economy around that? And then, as you'll see, what do we need to do in order to realize this potential? And then in 5 or 10 years, we'll be ready for the next one. We'll be ready for the next chapter. Right now, I think we're trying to write chapter 2 of modern Peruvian economic history. We've been through chapter 1. We're writing chapter 2. In 10 years, we're going to have to write chapter 3. And then we're going to have to write chapter 4. That's the nature of economic development. So what we've got in the presentation is a series of slides that say, okay, if you're really going to do this, what are the critical areas that we've got to dig in and do something about? And obviously, secure, neutral, and peaceful, you can see the list. Corruption, security, illegality, and regionalization. Because one of our security problems is, again, the lack of economic diversification and prosperity spread across the country. Okay, now those are at a very high level. What we have in our presentation, which I won't show you now, is now we can take these to another level. And we can take them to another level. And we can get very, very specific. Okay, if we really want to do this, what exactly would be the action agenda in each of these areas? In terms of making our resource clusters more sophisticated, again, there's a number of things that we have to do. Improve the infrastructure and the rules and the breadth of the cluster itself. Underneath this, there's a lot of specific steps. In terms of really becoming this hub for trade in the broader region, there's some kind of critical things we have to do. We have to maintain our gains as having low barriers to trade. We've got to get our trade-enabling infrastructure to be really, really efficient and develop clusters. In terms of decentralization, again, there's some kind of critical steps in that process. And again, beyond each of those is some detailed action steps. I mentioned earlier that as part of this, there's some missing bubbles in the middle there. Those are mysteries. Anybody that can guess what's in those charts gets a prize. Actually, it should say molds, tools, equipment, parts, and recycling. This is a cluster in Lima in metalworking. And unfortunately, the things in the middle are the metal. But all these other things are supporting that cluster. And I show this to you briefly, not for you to study this, but just to say that we actually had a process with the participants of this cluster, got them together, started talking about issues, started talking about weaknesses, started talking about what needed to be done to advance the efficiency, to advance the productivity, what were the gaps, what were the deficiencies. And we had an extraordinary process, which I found very encouraging. I think one of the earlier slides says Peruvians can be collaborative. There's a history of that. And we certainly found that in this project. So I'm very encouraged about the ability to mobilize bottoms-up activity in Peru to go along with all the top-down things that are going to happen by government. Again, we put a few more slides in just to talk about some of the details. Again, in every area, this team of you has, I think, pulled together a really remarkable amount of insight into kind of what are some of the things that need to be done. And again, I won't go through all the details with you because they're too complicated for a discussion like this. In terms of the cross-cutting policies, these are the areas that emerged as the most important priorities. securing our gains on macro, dealing with the cost of doing business, getting it even better, addressing questions around access to capital. Cost of capital is still too high. Interest rates are still too high. Banking and financial regulation needs improvement. Science, technology, longer term. Effectiveness of government. Getting government organizations to be productive, professional, and so on. Okay, this is a lot of stuff. But see, this is the problem of competitiveness. You can't make a country competitive by pushing one button or solving one problem. It's the nature of the problem. Competitiveness depends on everything. The schools, the roads, the regulation, the corruption, the legal system, it all matters. And so what that tells you is that when you're thinking about competitiveness, you can't think of it as solving the problem. You can only think about making progress, and then you have the next problem, and the next problem, and the next problem. That's the nature of this topic. And the countries that do the best job have a number of characteristics. Number one, they set some goals for themselves that help them make progress. And number two, they create an organization structure to allow them to implement. And number three, they find a way to achieve some consensus around the basic direction. So there's not always stopping and starting and stopping and starting. So let's talk about some of those things that might help Peru kind of make it happen. So I told you before, let's set some goals. If we're going to get to this strategy, what are some of the goals that we might want to set that are specific enough that we can kind of see how we're doing, and we can sort of have a national pride in trying to achieve those goals? So you can see the first 6. Peru will be, in 2021, in the upper tier of middle-income countries with an income per capita of $10,000 in current dollars. Peru will reduce its poverty level to 20%. Peru will reduce the rates of malnutrition to less than 10%. Peru will be one of the top 2 South American countries in terms of volume of trade with Asia. Because if we're going to be a hub, that's going to be a great measure of how well we're doing. Peru will be the first-ranked recipient of foreign direct investment among the countries in South America on the Pacific coast. Peru will have at least 7 regional development centers, maybe more, hopefully more. Those are some of the specific objectives. Now, are those crazy? Well, let's look at some data. So each of these charts here show you, this is our past. This is our present, 2010. This is our goal. So what do we have to do to get to 10,000? Well, what we have to do is we have to keep on this trajectory that we're on right now. Fairly ambitious. Not easy. Possible? Yes. It's possible. We really set this as a national goal, and this was something that motivated us. We can get this, we can meet this goal. We're not going to meet this goal until we can diversify prosperity in the economy, by the way. You can't have some people with $200 per capita income and other people with $500,000 and expect to get the average. If most of the people are low, you're not going to get the average to be this high. Reduce poverty level. Past, we got up to close to 60%. Present, we're down around 30. We can hit 20. We've moved poverty this far over a decade. Volume of trade with Asia. Past, almost none. Now that we've opened, wow, we're on an exponential curve. We're going up. Goal, which is that heavy line, which is Peru, touching up there where it does. Sure, we can do that. If we're consistently improving our infrastructure, if we're consistently improving the rules, and if we measure this every year, and if all of you here in the press write stories about it, if we're not making enough progress, we can hit this goal. First-ranked country in terms of foreign direct investment among countries along the South American Pacific coast. Our past, not much. Our present, making good progress. This is pretty ambitious, but Peru has a very rich environment for attracting foreign investment. And I think we've proved that in recent years. So this may seem impossible, but Chile isn't such a big country. We can do this. Let's talk about some more goals. Peru will pass from the third to the second tier in the evaluation made by the OECD Program for International Student Assessment, PISA. There is a structured process here. As we think about educational reform, let's figure out how to meet this goal and measure this every year and see how we're doing. All high school graduates in Peru will be proficient in the English language. If we can do that, we're going to be a much better trade hub. We're going to be a bigger magnet for investment. Our citizens will be much more connected to the world. We can do this. Corruption. The country will pass from mid-level to low-level for corruption in the region as measured by Transparency International. As you saw earlier, we're not moving exactly in the right direction right now. But I'm confident that if we set our mind to it, you can turn that around. Peru will adopt a cluster-based strategy for development. Bottoms up. Bottoms up. Peru will upgrade and develop well-established clusters in these fields. Again, these are things we can potentially achieve. This kind of tells us what it would look like to get from the past to the goal. We're on a trajectory. We are slowly moving in the right direction, but we can make this transition. The corruption one, as I say, we're kind of going the wrong direction right now. This would be a discontinuity. Think we can do it in Peru? Think you could actually bend this curve on corruption? Some of you are probably saying never, ever, impossible. I don't think so. I've seen countries do this before. If there's a consensus that this is important. If there's a consensus that corruption is literally draining the prosperity out of our country. It's not good for anybody except the people that are participating. It's not good for the country, not good for the citizens. We can change this. Now, a critical part of any economic strategy is sequencing. Sequencing, not trying to do every single thing at the same time. And this is always hard to do because you have all these problems, they're all important, they're all significant. You don't want to wait. It's a matter, though, more of staging. It's not that we're not going to do things, it's just we're going to stage ourselves. We put 4 areas as really the urgent now. Security, showstopper. You let this get out of hand, nothing else happens. Corruption, it will doom us to be lower income if we don't solve this problem. Because companies that aren't in mining won't come here. They just won't. Why would they? There's other places to go where the environment is better. Physical infrastructure, it's got to be pretty easy and pretty efficient to get in and out and do business and move goods and services around. That's really critical. We've made some good progress here in Peru. There's a lot of, some of the metrics look good here, but that's critical. And then skills. Notice I didn't say educational system. I just said skills. And what we know about economies is that with just a limited amount of training, 3 months, 6 months, in hospitality or running a machine tool or other specific areas, with just a little bit of training, if we're organized, we can make a big leap in terms of the quality of our workforce. So it's going to take 20 years to fix the education system, but the skill development system is something that has more immediate impact. That's on the now list. And the way we found to build skill development is to build it around clusters. Don't just develop any skill. Develop skills where you have a demand, where businesses are looking for people, where there's shortages. That's easy to find out. Just ask them. They'll tell you. Next here, education and healthcare, regional development, cluster development. Next here, financial systems, science and technology. Again, this is not the end of this discussion. It's a hard discussion. It's hard to set priorities. It's hard to sequence. But we got to do it. And it's really hard for a political leader. These political leaders here today, it's really hard because people come to you and all of them have a legitimate need to want things to get better in whatever area they're talking about. Usually, sometimes they don't have legitimate needs and you just have to listen and hope that they leave, but often the needs are legitimate. But that doesn't mean you have to do everything now. You've got to look at your capacity for implementation. Now, in terms of organizational structure, here's the problem. The problem is that with economic strategy, every single part of government touches it. There's no ministry of competitiveness. All the ministries affect competitiveness. So you have an organizational problem. The agenda of competitiveness is spread widely across government. And therefore, what we find is that the countries that are the most successful have some kind of a coordinating process at the highest level that allows the various parts of government and even representatives from outside the government to coordinate, synthesize, set priorities, and hold each other accountable for progress. In Peru, we believe that the best practical way of doing this is to re-energize the Peruvian National Competitiveness Council. We have one, but it's kind of moved off to the side. It hasn't been really a major institution lately. As the slides suggest, we would say, okay, this needs to go right in the Prime Minister's office and be chaired by the Prime Minister. What more important agenda for a Prime Minister than driving the competitiveness agenda of the country? All the key ministries that are most central to competitiveness need to be part of it, and we would say also should be some private sector leaders. It needs a secretariat to be the kind of glue that helps do the work to make things fit together. It needs a budget. It needs a few selected private sector leaders to kind of be there, to keep things grounded in reality, and to build bridges to the private sector. But we also believe very strongly that the private sector, which is most of you, need to organize yourself better for competitiveness. Right now we have a lot of voices. They talk in lots of different ways on lots of different issues in lots of different fields and lots of different sectors. We think now is probably the moment, as we're beginning Chapter 2 of the modern economic history of the country, for the private sector to create its own council on competitiveness. that has broad representation in the private sector, that can take the kind of work that we've started here and do it forever, and issue a report every year about the status of competitiveness in Peru, and do studies of difficult issues where government needs input. So we would recommend and hope that the private sector will be willing to step up to this plate. And I know some of you will. And I'm hoping that this meeting will be, again, an inflection point in that process. Well, I've only been able to scratch the surface in this session. We're talking here about one of the most challenging policy and leadership problems that you can ever imagine. How to move an entire economy with tens of millions of people towards prosperity when so many different things matter. I hope you understand that I have great admiration and respect for everything that's been accomplished so far. Chapter 1 was exciting, but it's time for Chapter 2. And with all due respect to my friend Al Gore, it's not automatic. This book might end prematurely if we don't write that next chapter. Okay, so it's time for Chapter 2. We've got a lot of assets to build upon. There's much more to be done. We need a strategy. We've laid out the beginnings of what a strategy might look like. We need some goals. We put forth some goals that might be part of the list. We need a process so that we can know who to blame and who to talk to if things aren't working. So the president can know, so the prime minister can know, so the private sector can know. We need a process. We need an organization structure. And we need a way to get more and more and more citizens, not just those of you here sitting in this wonderful meeting, to have a dialogue and understand this topic. Because so much of the problem we have in economic development around the world is simply misunderstanding. And people fight things emotionally or have an ideological perspective rather than a practical understanding of what the real issues are. So I'd like to, first of all, thank you very, very much for inviting me here today. I'm honored to be part of this incredible meeting. I'd like to thank you for your patience in listening to me for 90 minutes. This is not a sound bite, this subject. So I didn't give you a sound bite. It's more fun to do sound bites. But we've had a very serious discussion here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's a hard time to have a serious discussion about anything, much less competitiveness. I've overwhelmed you with data. But believe me, I edited out most of it. So you can thank me for that. The reason I'm here, 100% of the reason I'm here, is because I'm absolutely 100% certain that all of this stuff you can do. Thank you. Is that okay?
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias, doctor Porter. Ha sido realmente una conferencia extraordinaria. Al público tenemos ahora un break de 30 minutos para continuar con el panel, con la mesa de debate, siempre con el profesor. Aquellas personas que están utilizando los dispositivos para la traducción simultánea pueden quedárselos. Gracias.